I'm Faz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Litman, and this is Battleground. Faz is still gone this week, spending time with his very cute new baby. Our guest this week on Battleground is Maurice Mitchell, who's the National Director of the Working Families Party.
When everyday people come together, right, there isn't an obstacle that they can't overcome.
Maurice Mitchell, welcome to Battleground.
It's good to be here.
First, for those who may not be familiar with the Working Families Party, can you give us a short history?
Sure. Okay. Short history. Well, the Working Families Party started in the late 90s. And at the time, the Democratic Party had moved to a decidedly corporate sort of stance, the whole triangulation of the Clinton White House. And many people in labor and in grassroots organizations and progressives and others felt like it was time to develop an independent political structure that could electorally challenge what the Democrats were doing and pull them much closer to the left, but also be completely independent of their prerogatives. Since then, we've spread to a number of states. We have staff and operations in 20 states around the country. Ultimately, for us, a party is people, number one. That's like 4 ingredients, so people who come together to do electoral work, that's number 2, in order to advance an agenda, that's number 3, and that agenda is woven together by a coherent ideology, number 4. When that happens, you're a party. Whether or not you have ballot access or if legally and fiscally you filed with whoever, you're a party. And so that's how we understand our role in the country, to be this national grassroots political movement of everyday people, of labor unions, grassroots organizations, activists, organizers who come together and believe that our government should be run by the people and not corporations and the very wealthy.
The Working Families Party is understood to be building a multiracial working class movement. Can you define working class for the sake of how WFP thinks about it?
Sure. So the way that we understand it is people who have to wake up every day, who have to put in work in order to survive. So that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
That isn't just necessarily like maybe how you might classically understand working class people as like industrial wage earners, or
it's not like the economic term definition usually.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad group of people. It's a lot of folks. But we think that distinction is really important because there's a small number of people who just by virtue of their wealth and their class position, when they come together and organize politically through different vehicles, they have very, very different interests that we think collide with the interest of everyday people who have to work in order to feed themselves and their families. And so those are the people that we're attempting to organize.
What's your story? What's your background? How did you get into community organizing?
Both of my parents are immigrants from the Caribbean. They grew up in the rural Caribbean in poverty. My grandmother was the first person to come here as a domestic worker, and it's the typical immigrant struggle. She brought some folks over. Everybody's living in one apartment. Everybody's hustling. More people come over. She had a lot of kids, around like 10 kids. And in that context, I definitely learned very quickly the things that still inform my politics. I was able to see the differences, how race, class, gender, immigration status, how they really impact people's lives. As a young person, I was a youth organizer. I went to Howard University, spent a lot of time campus organizing at Howard University, and a lot on criminal justice issues and police violence. And then with the death of Michael Brown, with Trayvon's murder, with those looming very heavily on my soul and on my heart, that shifted the trajectory of my work. I and folks on the ground and folks around the country over years helped to build the movement for Black Lives and catalyze it to be an international movement. And Donald Trump got elected, which was, I think, a crisis for any freedom-loving, justice-loving person. And I thought it was really necessary to take the experiences that I had from movement building, from grassroots organizing, from issue organizing, from electoral organizing, and apply it to creating, at scale, a movement that could challenge the white Christian identity movement that Donald Trump sort of was able to ride to the White House.
one or two more sort of level setting questions here. New Yorkers are pretty familiar with Working Families Party. You know, we see it on our ballot every election cycle. We see it in the news. It's always a big thing. For people who are not New Yorkers and may not be as familiar with what WFP has accomplished, can you brag a little bit?
For the past 20 plus years, the New York WFP has been finding opportunities to recruit people, like regular people, sometimes activists, sometimes organizers, but progressives, to run and win against status quo candidates. Just to give you a sense of the arc, so Letitia James, people have heard of Letitia James. Her first electoral campaign, right, was an independent WFP third-party city council race. And now she is the Attorney General of New York, and it was her independent investigation that led to this reckoning with Governor Cuomo, who is a now former Governor Cuomo. The WFP in New York had a long multi-year strategy of electing progressives in the New York City Council. And now the New York City Council has a huge number of progressives, right, that are able to caucus together. My aspiration is that the WFP, or the forces in and around the WFP, can become a political third force in American politics.
So in New York, like I'm a voter in New York. I theoretically could register as a Working Families Party member. I'm registered as a Democrat because I like voting in presidential primaries from 2016. But you can register as a WFP member, and when you go to vote especially in the general election, candidates are often double listed as Democrats or WFP. And I would say I always vote WFP line in the general election so that you get the requisite number of votes to stay on the ballot for the subsequent cycle. In states where that's not the case, where there isn't fusion voting or the same kind of interaction on the ballot, how does Working Families Party function as a political party in the same way? Or is it not the same?
We're nimble and we're adaptive, and we look at the terrain and we decide how we could show up independent of the Democrats and Republicans, and be effective. And we figure out how to do that. And our North Star is to create the conditions where progressives govern. Not Democrats, progressives govern, right? So in the example of Philly and in some other Northeast cities, their city councils always have sort of set aside city council seats for the minority party, right? Mm-hmm. So that tends to be the Republican Party, right? And in a place that's so democratic like Philly, what it means is that the Republicans just have to lift a finger and they get these seats, these at-large seats. And we felt that there were more progressives than Republicans. And if we organize progressives around the WFP as an independent third party, we could take those at-large seats. We did that in 2019. Kendra Brooks, who is a independent, working class, socialist identified activist from Nicetown in Philly, is now a independent WFP at-large city council person. And this is the first time in modern history that we have a situation like that. In other examples, basically what we do is hack the Democratic Party's primary. That's what we do. So we recruit people, right, who aren't like dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, but who are true progressives. And we litigate that ideological fight through the Democratic primary. We essentially say, hey, Democrats, we're going to borrow your primary for a second, right? Recruit our people and have this conversation about what direction our country or this community should go in, and whether or not a government should be used as a vehicle to invest in people or not. And we recruit people in Democratic primaries and endorse people in Democratic primaries all over the country in order to do that. And so right now, for example, I'll give you, like, Georgia is kind of purplish. We have a staffed operation in Georgia. We have activists in Georgia. We threw down for Senator Reverend Warnock, right? And for a lot of reasons, for very, I think very evident reasons, we wanted to shift the balance of power in the Senate. We're interested in long term in shifting Georgia into becoming not just a blue, a progressive state. In every state, there are pockets of progressives that need a voice, and oftentimes the Democratic Party infrastructure has atrophied and simply doesn't have the capacity to effectively contend.
I think it's so interesting because I think it's an indication of the way that the Democratic Party sort of establishment has lost the long-term vision, which is something we come back to on this podcast all the time. It's when you're not engaging on these local ways, you are missing how you build power.
Absolutely. And also the whole idea of there being some red states and blue states, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely.
Right? And if you're only focused on investing in battleground states, then those are the battleground states. Right?
Yeah, it's tautological.
Yeah. And so challenging those concepts and investing in places where our people are, but have been ignored or haven't been resourced or invested in, that allows us to expand the map. I get super excited and I nerd out about the municipal and the legislative races. Those are our bread and butter. We endorse all the way up to presidential, but it's those races over time and that leadership development pipeline, I think that will transform our politics. This is what the far right has known for years. It's almost like cliche to talk about how the far right in the late 70s and the early 80s invested in school boards and other things. They really did that work. And over 40 years, it had a tremendous effect. We're living in the politics that they're organizing over 40 years, sort of created the conditions for. If we had that level of long arc thinking and that attention span, and
yep. It's a very good way of putting it.
think about what we could do in 20, 30, 40 years in this country.
Do you believe that we can stay a two-party country?
We live in a two-party state, very rigid two-party government, and also on top of that, we're a country that also is the size of a continent, and there's more than 300 million people. And why I say that is that we have a lot of diversity in this country, right? A lot of regional, racial, and ideological diversity that makes it hard for two parties to be able to hold. And I think that means that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are rife for rupture. So within the Republican Party, we're seeing that right now, right? Where actual white nationalists and sort of conspiratorial Trumpists are the protagonists of the Republican Party, right? And there are institutional Republicans, right? But they are not the protagonists within their own party. Now, in the Democratic Party, and progressives and leftists and others have a hard time processing this, but we are all in a united front, often with Democrats. I lead a separate party. Oftentimes, I join in a united front with Democrats. So it's almost like we are a multi-party sort of system, and people who don't see themselves as Democrats join in. Like we endorsed Joe Biden. Joe Biden was not our pick. When I look at the future, I think a number of things might happen. I think it's possible that the Republican Party might collapse on the weight of its contradictions, right? Mm-hmm. And turn into a regional versus a national phenomenon. That can only happen if we defeat their efforts to change the rules. They understand that they're at this existential crossroads. They're using political violence, the rigging of the rules, and then also trying to diversify. They're doing all three things, right? To kind of keep their thing together. I think that the Democratic Party is not impervious to rupture, right? I think as more and more independent progressives gain more and more power within the Democratic Party, it sets up a clearer ideological struggle between the corporate institutional interest and grassroots labor organizers. There will be, as the left side gains more power, that fight might happen and turn into rupture. If dialectically those conditions happen, we're building the structures in order to be that thing or part of that thing, that political third force. My aspiration is that the WFP or the forces in and around the WFP can become a political third force in American politics. And we actually popularly think about Democrat, Republican, working families. My, optimistic invitation is, what side of history do you want to be on? And who are your people in the limited time that you have on this planet?
One of the common critiques of the far left, and I think it is both done in bad faith and also, like most bad faith arguments, has like a little nugget of truth in there, is that the voters that ostensibly the far left and far progressives are often fighting for are often not aligned actually with progressive candidates. Especially, I think there's some tension between the economic values and the social or cultural values. How do you navigate that tension?
Organizing, right? Organizing. I think there's some folks who think that the righteousness of their political positions are self-evident, and all we need on the left or as progressives is a big enough megaphone. If we just spoke our convicted truths loud enough, the masses would immediately respond, right? I don't take that position. I think you need to organize your position. You need to struggle with people. I do believe that through organizing, and by that I mean creating enough space where a regular worker, let's just pick a teacher or an MTA worker after, driving their route on the bus, we could help salvage and protect some space for those people. So instead of thinking about the day-to-day reality, they're able to think one or two steps above that. And they're able to perceive their world one or two steps above that. I believe that when given that space, people will draw those connections for themselves. And be like, oh, wait, so instead of having all this antipathy against somebody I don't know, but I'm angry at because they're an immigrant, maybe I should have that antipathy against my boss and other bosses who cut my pay or cut my hours, right? You organizing helps you have the space to make that happen, but that requires consistent, sort of careful engagement with people on the ground, the multiracial working class. You build trust over time, and consciousness shifts over time. That's how we get there, and that's how we get our people, the multiracial working class, to align ideologically and electorally with their self-interest.
How do you as WFP and you as Maurice Mitchell handle that sort of center space of the overlapping Venn diagrams of elections and movement organizing?
Yeah, I as a person live in that intersection, right? And so the way that I've integrated that personally and also institutionally is to understand that we have different roles, right? We have different roles. We have different roles, and there's different types of power, and there's an ecosystem that we're attempting to build, and there's complementary powers that we're attempting to kind of nest together. So that's generally my proposition. And if you frame it like that, then I think that takes some of the pressure off of figuring out which tactic is right, which type of power is legitimate. We need to figure out how we're the answerers. And for working people who don't have billions of dollars, the state is the thing that has the most capacity to answer the questions that we pose through the movement and through mechanisms outside of the state.
How do you decide where is the line that a candidate who, as you well put, cannot always articulate the way that the movement wants it to?
Yeah.
What is the line?
There is no line, right? Mm-hmm. This is all about organizing and relationships, right? This is one of the reasons why WP, the way that we function, is through our local sort of internal democracy, which includes activists, folks from movements, folks from labor, who are in relationship with each other and in relationship with our members who are elected officials. Our members are also the elected officials who work with us on this strategy to figure out, like, what can I say to support and advance the movement and to be an invitation to the most people to our electoral project. That's the question that we're trying to answer. Each congressional election is unique to the fundamentals of that election, and there's so many variables: who the candidate is, who the right candidate is, the demographics of that, all those things. How can an elected official be in right relationship with movement, support the movement, never denigrate the movement, and be an invitation, a popular invitation to the electoral side of the work, right? And so if people are operating in good faith and are in right relationship with one another and actually care for one another and care about the broader project, over time they'll nail it. Our work is building party structures where over time we've created more connectivity between folks who otherwise wouldn't be connected. Where our tables, our party structures are a place where labor leaders, right, who might be, the labor leader might be an older white guy, and folks from the movement for Black Lives, and actual elected officials who are dealing with governance, and fired up activists and others are building camaraderie with one another so that they could figure out what is the most strategic and highest purpose for our movement electorally in this moment.
And I do think one of the problems that we often face is that it's so much easier to get mad to like punch at or punch down than it is to punch up, because it's really hard to win punching up. So you need, as an organizer, an optimistic vision. You need to be able to tell a story of here's how we are going to win and what we are going to win in order to get that person participatory and to think about the true enemy in the process. Maurice Mitchell, what is your optimistic vision? What is the story you tell people about what is possible?
I believe in people power. The thing that I know to be true, and I've experienced this in my own life, right, is that when everyday people come together, right, there isn't an obstacle that they can't overcome. I saw that on the ground in Ferguson. I've seen that in my campaign fights on issue campaigns, where a bunch of folks in Suffolk County came together, including people who had family members in the jail, and others, stop what looked like the inevitable doubling of the Suffolk County jail, like many years ago, right? I've seen on the local level, I've seen on the national level, I've seen on the international level. However, that's not inevitable. It's not, unfortunately, right? So we have this like potential power, right, that we could tap only through organizing, right? To me, that is the best argument for organizing. It is the thing that allows us as regular people to tap into our superpower, which is each other, right? And when we do that, yes, corporations with all of their money, City Hall, right, they could fall. Like, look at Governor Cuomo, looked like he was invincible just a few months ago. He's no longer governor. Another world is possible, but another world is not inevitable. Right? So I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about things, right? We live in a really hard world. We live in a world where people with power oppress and make the lives of people without as much power very hard. My, I guess, optimistic invitation is, what side of history do you want to be on, and who are your people in the limited time that you have on this planet? What do you want your grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know about you in this moment, in this very chaotic moment in history? It's very fulfilling to live your life, yes, for yourself, but for many other people. And sometimes you mess around and win really big things, and you're able to take down bullies. Who doesn't like taking down bullies? But the everyday sort of like maybe less flashy stuff, that's also pretty cool. It helps you declare for yourself and the people closest to you who you choose to be in this moment. And that could be very fulfilling. That could be very empowering. And that could help create so much meaning in a world that is increasingly hard to make meaning of for everyday people.
This is maybe the most optimistic conversation we've had on the show in a while. So Maurice Mitchell, National Director of Working Families Party, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.